Hello and welcome to the next video on this thing here. This, if you haven't already spotted, is something called the TBS Mojito. It's their latest wing that has been in pre-order for a little while now. This is something that I've been building and playing with for quite a few weeks, along with a number of other kind of test pilots. This has been a really fun build, but unfortunately due to the weather and access to the field, when it isn't snowing, blowing a gale, raining cats and dogs, also having a flying buddy that can be there for moral support and also to run the hat cam and other things too, it hasn't really worked for me. So I don't feel like I'm confident enough to kind of talk about what it's like to fly. I haven't got enough flight hours on it. However, this gentleman called Noah has. This is one of the other testers that has been playing with this thing. I need to say a massive thank you to Noah, because Noah and I have been chatting as we've gone through this, kind of sharing our experiences, and Noah has done significantly more flying on this than I have. And I thought, with the interest in the wing, it would be useful to have a video talking about what it's like to fly, some of the flying setup tips. I'm hoping that in the fullness of time, when I can get to the field, I'll be able to get my own flying footage and do a full flight review as I normally do. But because this is a slightly different wing from the ones that I tend to play with, I thought it would be useful to have somebody with a lot more experience on the sticks to talk about specific things, ideally building, tips for launching, what it's like to fly, and also tips for landing too. So a massive thank you for Noah for sparing the time and being kind of a support and moral support during this entire process, as well as doing his own testing and flying, but also providing some of the video footage that I'm going to insert here to illustrate things like the launching, flying and landing stuff too. The video is from Noah, and I need to thank him in a big way for allowing me to use that so you can actually see this thing in action. So let me go over to the Zoom call and we can talk to Noah about what this thing is like and some of the tips and tricks we've discovered with our playing. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is Noah, and we're using Zoom this time. You'll have seen another thing recently where I did it on Skype, and it means I'm kind of stuck up there in the corner. Used to be a lot more useful. So we're on Zoom, so you can see us both here. So say hello, Noah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Noah. Happy to be here.
So Noah, as I explained in the introduction, is another one of the pilots that's been able to get his hands on the TBS Mojito and has been flying it much more than I have. Speaking to Noah, Noah's been incredibly useful for me in kind of sharing some of his experience flying this thing. So what I want to do, as I've explained in the intro, was just kind of run through this relatively high level. I think there's going to be lots of flight reviews over the next coming months as people actually get their pre-ordered units and start building everything. Caveat, caveat, caveat. Noah and I are recording this before the manual is complete and it has been published. So everything that we're talking about is stuff that we have discovered by just figuring it out. So there may be slightly better ways to do everything. Refer to the manual for the latest and greatest and the official version, but I always find talking to a pilot that's had lots of hours on a model really, really useful, because they'll tell you all the stuff that isn't in the manual. And you know what? That's usually the stuff you really need to know. So Noah, can we quickly talk about the build first of all? You discovered a couple of things. I think it was you that was one of the people that realized that we had to do things like separate the elevons and attach them using something like tape was a useful trick. Can you talk about some of the things that you've discovered over the flying with it over the past 6-8 weeks?
So when I was flying, building this wing, rebuilding it, trying out different things, there are a couple of things that I noticed. And one of the things you already mentioned is about the elements. It's not something that I'd say everyone needs to do so. The wing flies absolutely fine as it is. If you are just about cruising, going long range, having those scenic flights, it's perfect for that. But if you want that absolute edge of that agility, of that maneuverability, what I found worked quite well for me is to cut the foam connection between the elevon and the main body of the wing and replace that with a tape hinge. There are tons of videos of that on YouTube, on the internet, out there, how to do this properly. But once I went with that, the ailerons were able to move quite a bit more and quite a bit more freely. And that gave me quite a bit more agility when flying. Another thing that I noticed was the CG. There are markings under the wings that indicate where your CG should be at. And of course, we all know the saying, a wing that's front heavy will fly bad. A wing that's back heavy will only fly once. This is also true for the Mojito, of course. And if you're unsure, I would suggest that you put your CG maybe a millimeter or two up front. It might give you a bit more maneuverability. Just watch out that your plane is not back heavy. That's something to watch out for. Big disclaimer.
The other thing that we talked about was the batteries needed for CG. We talked, it's probably between 450 to 600 grams of battery is needed in the nose. There is a very large canopy for you to move the batteries around. However, obviously, the bigger battery and the further back you have it, the more weight there is in the model. It's already quite a sturdy thing. So I would personally go with 2 lightweight 2200 4S's in the nose to give you 8S, and that will get it right. The way that I've been setting the CG and talking to Trappy, he likes to do it, is put his fingertips right at the leading edge, just in front of where that CG mark is, and he's flying it there also too. So that seems to be a common thing everyone's found. The other thing just to mention, since I did my other 2 videos, there have been, and I've put notes on those videos as well, but there are additional wing stiffeners that have been, that will be in the kits that will be sent out when you pre-order them now. The preview units and the test units that Noah and I have been using haven't had that in, but I'm gonna glue in some very thin ribbon-based carbon fiber reinforcement at the rear and back, so it's more like the one that you're going to buy. The next thing then to talk about is launching tips and tricks. Now, with this being a little bit heavy and with the wings clipping in with a catch, it does mean that it isn't going to support a discus launch. When I talked to Trappy about that, all the colour drained out of his face. He was like, please do not discus launch it, because that latch isn't designed to have the whole weight of the model on a discus style launch. So you've kind of perfected a way of launching this thing, and actually I'll insert a video here while you talk us through it.
Yeah, there are basically 2 ways of launching this wing when you're alone, not talking, of course, when you have help and stuff, then there might be more option. Basically, there's one option to have a bungee launch. The wing has a hook to hook a bungee cord on at the bottom. It's a carbon fiber hook, so it's very sturdy. It's made for that. It's super easy to use. You can hook on there and use that to launch and give it basically that initial acceleration. The other thing is to do the overhead throw. And what works very well is INAV auto launch. And it works very, very well on this wing for the people I know that have flown it with auto launch before. It does a very nice climb. I set a launch angle of around, or climb angle of around 20 to 25 degrees. That works fine with me. You need to just watch out when you throw the wing that you don't throw it too straight up, because then the wing loses speed basically, and it stalls before it can actually start climbing. So when you do the throw, watch out that you throw it relatively level or relatively close to that 20 to 25 degree angle that is set in INAV. I would not recommend going for a much steeper climb angle, as the steeper the angle it is, the more difficult it is to get it into that angle with enough speed.
It will kind of climb vertically on 8S. So if you're not flying it on 6S, you're flying it on 8. There is lots and lots of power. So if you give it a good throw over your head, and again, Noah has been doing it without the prop spinning and setting the throttle when the launch is complete to 1800. So not full, but so it's safe when it passes over his head, and then the motor will start. And as you can see in the video, it actually works really nicely. Some of the other test pilots have actually had the prop spinning. Be super careful when you're using 2-handed overhead throws. Keep your arms straight. Don't bend your elbows. Keep that plane nice and far away from you. Try and throw it over your head, gently into the air. Once the prop kicks in, it will absolutely climb away. Just make sure if you're going to pre-spin the prop, I know some people like to do that, With something like this, where you have to use the two-handed throw, I would exercise extreme caution, at least have some kind of hat or helmet on, because that's how things happen. So just be a bit careful. But the big trick here is use iNav Auto Launch. It's your best friend.
If you're going to use the pre-spinning of the prop, for some reason, I've seen people do it, but use some kind of protection with it, because it could be really, really dangerous when like a prop spinning with 8S power hits your face. That's not going to end well. So it works absolutely fine. If you just set the motors to start after the throw, it launches just fine. Just watch out.
So the next thing to talk about then is the flying. And I need to say again, a massive thank you to Noah here for sharing some of his flight footage. As I said in the introduction, I just haven't had a chance to get out and fly it enough to be able to feel that I'm confident in having a chat with it about how it's actually flying. So Noah, can you talk a little bit about how you found it? Because some of your on-screen display stuff that I've looked at, it looks like it's not a slow wing, and it looks reasonably efficient too.
Yeah, once you get this thing in the air, it flies like a champ. It's super smooth, super efficient. It cruises at around 70 kilometers per hour. At least for me, that's what I found a comfortable cruising speed. But yeah, it's quite a comfortable cruising speed. During that flight, for me, it consumes about 6 to 7 amps. On 8S. So your mileage might vary, of course, depending what battery you use, what voltage you use. I use relatively small batteries. I use two 4S 2300 milliampere hour Tattoo batteries. That gets me around 15 to 20 minutes of flight time. If you trust the post-flight statistics, I can easily get above 30, 35 kilometers of travel if I'm not paying attention. And probably if I pay attention to keeping it efficient, then I would get way more. And this is a great thing, paying attention to keeping it efficient. This wing is super fun to fly. Like if you give it full throttle, it will go to around 180 kilometers per hour. That's what I found. And it's super, super quick. And even then it's relatively efficient. You can sustain that speed for multiple minutes, not just seconds. And you can really make a lot of distance with that. Watch out for turns, because the wing needs a lot more airspeed in the turns, because it's a lot easier to stall in the turns because of the nature of the forward facing wings. But apart from that, it's a breeze.
So in terms of the speed envelope, it's a pretty wide speed envelope. Around 35 miles an hour and below is roughly where we are in stall territory. It's not a great wing for floating about. It also is a relatively heavy plane, so you need quite a bit of airspeed to keep the lift and to keep the airflow stuck on these very, very thin wings that are part of the Mojito. So when you're coming in, and we're going to talk about landing in a minute, you kind of need to keep it well above that speed. So as Noah just said, as you turn, you don't have one of the wings entering a stall situation. It can go extremely fast. I know some of the other stuff I've been looking at, people cruising around about 120 kilometers an hour, pulling about 10 amps. So, you have a pretty wide speed envelope. It is very quick. It is quite loud. It's not nano DRAC or DRAC levels of loud by any stretch of the imagination. It's not that everybody in the local county can hear you flying, but when you open the tap, it is a 8S model running a reasonably sized aggressive prop. So, you do get a bit of noise. However, because that motor is stuck out on the back of that pylon, it's in pretty clean airflow. So that's what a lot of that noise from things like the DRACs was coming from. In terms of the acrobatic ability, I know you've been flipping and rolling it around. You found that actually, even though the control surface movement appears relatively low, you found that it flips and rolls quite well, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Something to keep in mind there is if you want to do those acrobatic moves, turn around, trees and so on, go low, do those flips, turns, whatever the rolls, you need quite a bit of speed, because the elements, as you mentioned, don't have that much deflection in relation to other airplanes which are made for acrobatics. You need quite a bit of speed to get that authority needed for that acro flight. So you won't be able to do that super acro stuff at that minimum cruising speed. Just give it a bit more speed and then you should be good to go. But also expect that when you do these rolls, it will lose quite a bit of speed. So you might need to raise your throttle or respec that with having sufficient height to recover after it.
I think what Noah and I are saying here is this is not a plane that you're going to fly slowly. This is not a plane that you fly less than 50% throttle. This is a plane that you throw it, fly it like you stole it, burn the skies, have a fantastic 10-15 minutes, land it, and then lie down in a dark room with a real mojito to get your blood pressure back down. This is a plane that if you want to have that kind of relaxy fly acrobatic stuff, there's probably other airframes around that probably be more suited for you. Now, talking about speed, we've talked about it, how fast it can go and how quickly it can get there. One of the other things that we're worthwhile talking about is the spoiler-ons, and I've shown those. Now, Noah and I have both had an interesting journey because we had pre-production units. We've had to kind of retrofit new plastics and other bits and pieces as well. So we're both not using caveat, the production version of the spoiler-ons. But I know when you are using them to slow the model down, you found that it affects the pitch a little bit. And also you can't have them too far up. Otherwise you get into trouble, can't you?
That's something I discovered quite quickly. So a recommendation, if you try those out, do it with sufficient height so you can recover if something goes wrong. Because if you put those spoiler-ons up, the plane will pitch up quite heavily or pitch down depending on how you have stuff set. Because you need to compensate with a movement of the elements so it doesn't just completely turn away. That will affect like your level flight. If you're in angle mode, INAV might be able to compensate for it so you don't even notice it. But if the setting is too way off, even INAV will not have enough authority to correct it. So take it slow and raise it step by step. In my opinion, if you put it to the full deflection where it's almost vertical, basically, that's not really useful because it basically creates such a high drag that the plane slows down that much that you're almost immediately going into territory of speeds that are close to stalling. So in my case, I set two different positions for these spoiler-ons. Okay. One is just slightly up, and one is, I'd say, about a centimeter or 1.5 up from the surface. And that gets me quite a bit of slowdown when I do a landing or stuff. But more than that wasn't really helpful for me.
Talking to Trappy, he reckons that a 30-degree, and again, we're talking before the manual has been created here, a 30-degree angle is the maximum you should probably use. I think what Noah's described is the best way to do it. I would err on the side of caution, maybe go up 10-15 millimeters at the trailing edge of that spoiler on, have a fly, see how that affects it. Again, using angle or horizon mode in INAV is going to help compensate for any pitch adjustments that happen when you deploy those. I've got it set on a switch. I've done very similar thing to Noah on mine. It has two positions, and I've also set it so it goes into those positions relatively slowly over a second. So rather than there being a snap movement, which is not great for the servos anyway, but also potentially is going to cause INAV a little bit of a hiccup. And you can even set up a mix on the radio so that you can't deploy the spoiler-ons. If you're in manual or acro, you can only deploy them when you're in a self-level mode. So that kind of brings us beautifully, I guess, onto the last thing I want to talk to you about, which is landing. Because, of course, if we have a plane that only likes to do 35 plus miles an hour, although it can recover reasonably well, if you've seen from the launches that the video that Noah very kindly provided for this video, it can kind of recover if you need to get out of it. The challenge with this plane is because it is so slippy, because it is relatively heavy and has quite high wing loading, which is why we have to be a bit careful with the stalling stuff. It does mean that it doesn't slow down very well. So even when you will come off the throttle, it has a fantastic glide slope. So you have to really think about when you're coming in for approach, using those spoiler-ons to help disrupt the airflow and create additional drag to slow it down. But this isn't one of those things that you shoot across the end of the field, do a hard bank, and then just bring it in. This is one of those things that you have to think about. And I would expect that you kind of have to think it's like landing a 737. You have to start way out and you have to kind of bring it in, manage the speed, manage the height, and manage the attitude so that by the time it's over the bits of grass that you want to land in, going to be above the stall speed so you can move the wings without it stalling out and crashing. but it's going to come in. Now, you've actually used the 3D printed nose on yours, haven't you, Noah, just to help, so because it will come in relatively quickly, just to protect the front of the craft.
Yeah, like I had my fair experience of landings. Something that I need to say here, you don't need these spoilerons, because I did most of my flights before there were even working versions of the spoilerons. So it works just fine without those. It just needs a bit of practice, as with everything with that plane when it comes to landing. So you can land this plane with a hard bank, but it needs some practice. Why is it a bit of a tricky situation? As I mentioned, it glides very well. So at cruising speed, at 1 kilometer of distance, it only loses about 100 meters of height. So a 1-to-10 ratio, that's relatively flat. But on the other hand, if you do a turn, it will stall very quickly. So you basically need to balance it, because once you slow down, you can't really turn too much anymore, because then it will stall. So you need to figure out quite nicely how you do it. I resulted in basically approaching the runway at a 90-degree angle, then doing a 90-degree turn, which slows the plane down well enough, and then approaching the landing strip at around 10 meters of height. And that is quite nice for how I do it. And yes, I'm using a 3D printed nose on my wing. Yeah, those landings are not too gentle in the beginning. So you will touch up or touch down with the nose quite frequently. And for me, it was very helpful to have a 3D printed nose instead of the foam nose.
I think what we're both saying here is that the landing is probably the part that you have to think about the most when you're flying a Mojito. And I wouldn't fly it in a place where it's surrounded by high trees, because you won't be able to get the plane back in. Ideally, you need a place that's a little bit more open, that allows you to have a little bit more of a run in, so you can line up on the landing area that you want to put the plane down in, and that you can come in without having to bank the model, so that as it loses speed, you don't have a situation where the wings will stall and it'll just float in. And that, don't be afraid personally to go around. And in your first flights, I personally would not fly it for the 15 minutes so there's nothing left in the battery, and then have one chance to get it in. I would recommend practice the landings over your first half a dozen flights. When there's still half of the battery left, have a go at a couple of approaches, get used to how it feels, and then if you're not happy, you can bail out and go around again. But make sure you're flying in a sufficiently large area so that you can get this very quick, very slippery plane back down. Because even though we have the spoilerons, what we really need are a couple of parachutes to slow it down rather than spoilerons. So you just need to think about it and it'll be fine. Noah, any other tips and tricks before we finish the video? I think that's been really, really great today. Thank you for your time and sharing your know-how.
Something that I want to mention, that it might come over a bit wrong from that talk here. This isn't a plane that you can just use for short flights to blast around your airspace and so on. This can really also do the distance. Like if you don't go all the time those max speeds, but keep it at maybe cruising speed plus 30%, that plane can go for a long time. So those 15 minutes with like these small batteries are more than enough to fly to the limit of your video range in most cases if you're flying digital. And also, we're using, or at least Lee and I, other pilots use different configurations, use the smallest possible battery configuration that can get the plane balanced. So you have the option to go probably double or 3 times the size. And maybe if you go lithium ion batteries, you get even more. And like, don't perceive this as this is only like a short flight time plane. If you use a more conservative power train, or even just switching out the battery, that will give you tons of flight time if that's what you're aiming for.
I have a very large battery here that's 6S that it will balance with. I think it's one of the GMB packs. And Trappy and I were talking and doing some back of a post-it note calculation. We reckon we get about 40 minutes out of that kind of battery. So again, although it is really designed for speed and that kind of fun flying. As Noah says, if you put a big enough battery in it, it'll fly for a very long time because it is very efficient and it can cover ground very quickly for a relatively low amp draw. The only thing is, the bigger battery, the more it weighs. I would probably not hand launch it with that big battery. I would probably want to invest in some kind of bungee launcher or stick launcher, and I'll put a link down to a couple of projects for things like that. So if you're going to get into those heavier configurations, my personal advice would be, if you're not going for the light batteries like Noah and I are using, don't go hand launch. It's too dangerous. I would probably get yourself a bungee, and then when it launches, you're well away from that spinning prop. Noah, thanks again for the time today. I will say goodbye here, and do stay tuned. There'll be lots more videos coming. I'll put links down to Noah's stuff below. Go and check out his stuff. And thanks again, Noah, for all the help and advice during our testing with it here. It's been great to hear how you've been getting on with your flying. So thanks again, everybody. Happy flying, and stay tuned. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Pedantry 60 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.